Good morning, students. Today we're doing Chapter 14, Section 4, The Movement to End Slavery on page 454. If you were there, you live in southern Ohio in the 1850s. A friend who lives across the river in Kentucky has asked you to join a network that helps escaping slaves. She reminds you that your house has a secret cellar where you could easily hide fugitives for a few days. You are opposed to slavery, but you know this might get you into trouble with your neighbors and with the law. Would you become an agent for the Underground Railroad, and why? Building background. The early 1800s brought movements for social reform in the United States. Perhaps the most important far-reaching was a movement for the abolition of slavery. To abolish slavery or to get rid of slavery. That's what abolition or abolitionist means. While reformers worked to end slavery, many also took the risks to help slaves escape. Americans opposed slavery. Some Americans had opposed slavery since before the country was founded. Benjamin Franklin was the president of the first anti-slavery society in America, the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. In the 1830s, Americans took more organized action supporting abolition or a complete end to slavery. Differences among abolitionists. Abolitionists came from many different backgrounds and opposed slavery for various reasons. The Quakers were among the first groups to challenge slavery on religious grounds. Other religious leaders gave speeches and published pamphlets that moved many Americans to support abolition. In one of these, the abolitionist Theodore Well wrote that every man knows that slavery is a curse. Other abolitionists referred to the Declaration of Independence. They reminded the American Revolution had been fought in the name of liberty, and liberty is freedom. Anti-slavery reformers did not always agree on the details. However, they differed on how much equality they thought African Americans should have. Some believed that African Americans should receive the same treatment as white Americans. In contrast, other abolitionists were against full political and social equality. Some abolitionists wanted to send free African Americans to Africa to start new colonies. They thought this would prevent conflicts between the races in the United States. In 1817, a minister named Robert Finley started the American Colonization Society, an organization dedicated to establishing colonies of freed slaves in Africa. 5 years later, the society founded the colony of Liberia on the west coast of Africa. And by the way, Liberia still exists to this day. About 12,000 African Americans eventually settled in Liberia. However, many abolitionists who once favored colonization later opposed it. Some African Americans also opposed it. David Walker was one such person. In his 1829 essay, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, Walker explained his opposition to colonization. The greatest riches in all America have arisen from our blood and tears, and they, meaning the whites, will drive us from our property and homes which we have earned with our blood. That is a quote from David Walker, quoted from Slavery to Freedom. Spreading the abolitionist message, abolitionists found many ways to further their cause. Some went on to speaking tours or wrote pamphlets and newspaper articles. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote about abolitionist poetry and literature. William Lloyd Garrison published an abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Beginning in 1831 and 1833, he helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society. Its members wanted immediate emancipation and racial equality for African Americans. Garrison later became its president. Both the Liberator and the Anti-Slavery Society relied on support from free African Americans. Society members spread anti-slavery literature, petitioned Congress to end federal support of slavery. In 1840, the American Anti-Slavery Society split. One group wanted immediate freedom from enslaved African Americans, and a bigger role for women. The others wanted gradual emancipation and for women to play only minor roles in this movement. Angela and Sarah Grimke, we're looking on page 455 right now. Two white Southern women were anti-slavery activists in 1830. They came from a South Carolina slaveholding family, but disagreed with their parents' support of slavery. Angela Grimke tried to recruit other white Southern women in a pamphlet called Appeal to Christian Women of the South in 1836. I know you do not make the laws, but if you really suppose you can do nothing to overthrow slavery, you are greatly mistaken, she said. Try to persuade your husband, father, brother, and sons that slavery is a crime against God and man. That is from Angela Grimke. This essay was very popular in the North. In 1839, the Grimke sisters wrote American Slavery as It Is, the book that was one of the most important anti-slavery books of its time. African American abolitionists. Many former slaves were active in the anti-slavery cause. Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery when he was 20 and went on to become one of the most important African American leaders in the 1800s. Douglass secretly learned to read and write as a boy despite a law against it. His public speaking skills impressed members of the Anti-Slavery Society. In 1841, they asked him to give regular lectures. At a 4th of July celebration in 1852, he captured the audience attention with his powerful voice. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. Those were words from Frederick Douglass, important words indeed. In addition to many of his speaking tours in the United States and Europe, Douglass published a newspaper called the North Star and wrote several autobiographies. His autobiographies were intended to show the injustices of slavery. Another former slave, Sojourner Truth, also contributed to the abolitionist cause. She claimed that God had called her to travel through the United States and preach the truth about slavery and women's rights. With her deep voice and quick wit, Truth became legendary in the anti-slavery movement for her fiery and dramatic speeches. Other African Americans wrote narratives about their experiences as slaves to expose the cruelties that many slaves faced. In 1861, Harriet Jacobs published The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, one of the few slave narratives by a woman. William Wells Brown wrote anti-slavery play as well as personal narratives in the form of a novel called Clotel. So, our reading check is finding main ideas. In what ways did African Americans participate in the abolitionist movement? Well, it seems like there was a lot of strong, important voices making speeches and touring, talking about the evils of slavery. Very important for this anti-slavery movement. The Underground Railroad, page 456. By the 1830s, a loosely organized group had begun helping slaves escape from the South. Free African Americans, former slaves, and a few white abolitionists worked together. They created what became known as the Underground Railroad. The organization was not actually a railroad, but was a network of people who arranged transportation and hiding places for fugitives or escaped slaves. Fugitives would travel along freedom trails that led them to northern states and sometimes Canada. At no time did the railroad have a central leadership. No one person or group or people was ever officially in charge. Despite the lack of any real structure, the Underground Railroad managed to achieve dramatic results. Often wearing disguises, fugitives moved along the railroad at night, led by people known as conductors. Many times the fugitives had no other guideposts but the stars. They stopped to rest during the day at stations, often barns or attics or other places on properties owned by abolitionists known as station masters. The station masters hid and and fed the fugitives. Harriet Tubman, and there's a nice picture of Harriet Tubman on page 456, was a courageous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Personally, I believe she was involved of hundreds of slaves escaping to their freedom. You can see a nice picture on page 457 of the Underground Railroad, and look where the green is, which is more the southern and slavery areas to the more northern purple areas. The Underground Railroad main ideas: abolitionists organized the Underground Railroad to help enslaved Africans escape. All right. The most famous and daring conductor on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. When Tubman escaped slavery in 1849, she left behind her family. She swore that she would return and lead her whole family to freedom in the North. Tubman returned to the South 19 times, successfully leading her family and more than 300 other slaves to freedom. At one time, there was a reward for Tubman's capture, reportedly climbed to $40,000, a huge amount of money at that time. Opposition to ending slavery. Although the North was at the center of the abolitionist movement, many white Northerners agreed with the South and supported slavery. Others disliked slavery but opposed equality for African Americans. Newspaper editors and politicians warned that freed slaves would move north and take jobs from white workers. Some workers feared losing their jobs to the newly freed African Americans, who they believed would accept lower wages. Abolitionist leaders were threatened with violence, and some Northerners joined mobs, such as a mob to kill abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy in 1837 in Alton, Illinois. The federal government also obstructed abolitionists. Between 1836 and 1844, the U.S. House of Representatives used what was called a gag rule. Congress had received thousands of anti-slavery petitions, yet the gag rule forbade members of Congress from discussing them. This rule violated the First Amendment right of citizens to petition the government, but the Southern members of Congress did not want to debate slavery. Many Northern members of Congress preferred to avoid the issue. Eventually, the representative and former President John Quincy Adams was able to get the gag order overturned. His resolution to enact a constitutional amendment halting the expansion of slavery never passed. Many white Southerners saw slavery as vital to the South's economy and culture. They also felt outsiders should not interfere with their way of life. After Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, when Turner led some slaves to kill slaveholders, open talk about slavery disappeared in the South. It became dangerous to voice anti-slavery sentiments in the Southern states. Abolitionists like the Grimke sisters left rather than air unpopular views to hostile neighbors. Racism, fear, and economic dependence on slavery made emancipation all but impossible in the South. Drawing conclusions on the reading check, why did many Northern workers oppose the abolitionist movement? Because they felt that their jobs were in jeopardy. Summary and preview. The issue of slavery grew more controversial in the United States during the first half of the 19th century. In the next section, you will learn about women's rights. Thank you for following along with me in Chapter 14, Section 4. Have a great day, people.